I am now very delighted to introduce you to Dr. David Suzuki, a scientist, environmentalist, journalist. I would like to really thank you because I know that you just arriving from your amazing Blue Dot tour all over Canada that just ended last Sunday. So please join me in welcoming David Suzuki for a talk on global environmental issues and challenges. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir. Malheureusement, je ne suis pas bilingue et je parlerai en anglais. Excusez-moi. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share a few ideas with you this evening. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that this is the unceded traditional territory of the coastal First Nations. I am a scientist by training and profession. A geneticist, not a climatologist. But as a science journalist, I know that scientists are very happy to talk about making a breakthrough or a discovery that's going to lead to a cure for cancer or solve the problem of world starvation through biotechnology. That's all just PR baloney. But they love to do that stuff. But they're very reluctant to get up and talk about things that might be contentious or very controversial. So I've found it as a journalist, I've been amazed at the near unanimity of climatologists and their willingness to speak out in very, very urgent terms. So I think that in itself demands that society take what they're saying very, very seriously, because this is not normal for a group of scientists to speak out the way they have. As Bill McKibben has said over and over again, governments did come to an agreement at Copenhagen not to allow emissions to rise above 2 degrees this century. I happen to think 2 degrees is too high. As a biologist, it's already approaching catastrophe. But a commitment was made, and politicians love to make commitments like that, of course. I mean, none of these guys that made the commitment in Copenhagen is going to be around even halfway to the end of this century. So, yeah, we can promise all kinds of things. But as McKibben has said, and as the video said, once you make that commitment, then the physics is very clear. That we may be able to burn 250 billion tons, release that much carbon into the atmosphere, but it says there is a limit. And when you take that limit seriously, 80% of the known deposits of oil have to be left in the ground. So what's all this development of the tar sands? Most of that's going to have to be left in the ground. There's no argument about pipelines or expanding rail service. They have got to be something that we're not going to spend a cent on. Certainly no more exploration for oil. Very, very clear. If we're serious about setting that as a target. I am so honored that France would even spend any time in Canada listening to Canada talk about climate change when our government's record is just so humiliating to the vast majority of Canadians. I realized it came to an hour speech written out, and I threw that out. So I've been trying desperately to figure out what the hell can I say in 15 minutes. To me, the most frightening aspect of what's going on now is the incredible inertia that prevents us from making really profound change. Just want to remind you, of course, as a journalist, I knew about climate change. We called it global warming back in the 70s and 80s. But I always referred to global warming as a slow motion catastrophe. I really thought that it was going to kick in 70, 80, 90 years, maybe even a century. And so I was much more focused, as were most of us, I think, on issues of deforestation, of toxic pollution, of ocean depletion. These were the kinds of bread and butter issues of environmentalists during the 70s and 80s. It was in 1988 that I was invited to Australia by a newly formed organization called the Commission for the Future. And in Melbourne, they made me look at what was going on in terms of climatology and the whole threat of global warming. And that was when I realized, wow, this isn't something we can wait any longer, because so many decisions have to be made now in 1988 in order to avoid the dangerous buildup of greenhouse gases. In 1988, I just want to remind you that a man ran for President of the United States and promised, if you vote for me, I will be an environmental president. Anyone want to guess who that was? His name was George H.W. Bush. There wasn't a green bone in his body, but he said it because Americans had put the environment at the top of the agenda. In 1988, Margaret Thatcher was filmed picking up litter in London, and she turned a camera and said, well, I'm a greenie too. In 1988, we re-elected Brian Mulroney, and to show that he cared about the environment, he appointed his brightest star to be the Minister of the Environment. That was Lucien Bouchard. And I interviewed Bouchard 3 months after he was appointed. I said, what have you found is the most critical issue confronting Canadians? And immediately he said global warming. And I said, how serious is it? And he said, it threatens the survival of our species. We have to act now. So the politicians had heard what the public's concerns were. In 1988, Ken Hare at the University of Toronto called a meeting of 300 climatologists from around the world to the university. And at that meeting, climatologists said, the evidence is in, we're causing climate change, we have to take action. And their press release at the end of the conference said, global warming represents a threat second only to all-out nuclear war. And they called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. So there we were. The public was on side, the scientists had spoken, the target had been set, and of course, nothing really has happened. It's certainly in our country of Canada. And the question is, what has gone wrong? And I think there are a multiplicity of problems. One is the direct attack on scientists and their credibility, and I think it's been quite successful. The tens of millions of dollars spent by the fossil fuel industry, as well as rich people like the Koch brothers in the United States, have created the sense that this is junk science, that this is a natural phenomenon, humans can't possibly be a part of this, and besides which scientists lie and cheat, and they do all kinds of things just to get more research money. We live as well so I think that the corporate agenda has really become the dominant agenda that most governments now seem to try to run after. But we have also shattered the world that we live in. We no longer see the world in its complexity and in its interconnectivity. When we buy a cotton shirt, I don't think many of us ask, is this organic? We don't realize the consequences of buying a cotton article of clothing that reverberates around the planet. Globalization means that we get products from all over the world without any concept of what the local ecosystem or social or even economic consequences are of those activities. So we don't any longer see the way that we are connected to that world out there. I'm truncating this now. I'd like to just give you a context within which the discussion will go on this evening. I have spent a great deal of my life fighting, and we've won many battles, like stopping dams or tanker traffic down the west coast from Alaska, down the BC coast, or stopping drilling in dangerous places like Hecate Strait or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But many of the battles that we thought we won 35 years ago, we find we're fighting the same battles again. And so I've realized that we can't go on fighting, because whenever there's a battle, there's a winner and a loser. And when environmentalists win their battles, they're not permanent, they're temporary. Because the real issue is the way that we see our place on the planet. And I think we no longer see ourselves connected. A great deal of that is because we've undergone this immense change in the way that we live. In 1900, when there were just over 2 billion people in the world, there were only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. London was the largest with 6.5 million people. Tokyo was the 7th largest with 1.5 million people. So the vast majority of people around the world lived in rural village communities. And farmers understand very well that weather and climate and that we're very dependent on nature. In only 100 years, we underwent this amazing transformation. Although there were 6 billion people by the end of the last century, there were now more than 400 cities with more than 1 million people. The 10 largest all had more than 11 million. Tokyo went from 1.5 million to 26 million people. So we've been transformed from a rural village species into a big city dweller. And in a big city, our highest priority becomes our jobs. We need a job to make the money to buy the things we want. And so really, we no longer see that nature is very relevant. I'm asked in cities, well, why do we need to protect nature as long as there are parks to go camping and playing in? Who needs nature? I need my job. So the economy comes to assume a dominant position in our lives. And when the Prime Minister of Canada says we can't afford to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because it will destroy the economy, he elevates the economy above the very atmosphere that keeps us alive. So somehow we've got to change the discussion, it seems to me. So my more recent conversion is I don't want to fight. I had a CEO of a major company in Fort McMurray, an oil company, ask if he could come and see me in Vancouver. I said, of course. And when he came to the door, I said, I don't want to fight. I don't want to negotiate. I want you to leave your identity outside the door, and I want to talk to you as a human being. What are the most fundamental needs that we have? That we would all agree that these are the basic needs for all human beings. Well, he was immediately very, very unhappy because he had come down as a CEO of a big company to negotiate with me. So I said, look, let me just tell you what I mean. I want you to agree with me. If you don't have air for 3 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air, you're sick. So can we not all agree that clean air has got to be the highest priority of any society on the planet? If you don't have water for 3 days, you die. If you have to breathe polluted water, you're sick. Can we put clean water up there and then clean food? Some of us might last 6 weeks, but between 4 and 6 weeks after no food, you die. If you have to eat contaminated food, you get sick. So can we put soil and clean food up there? And then all of the energy in our bodies that we need to move and grow and reproduce is sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis. So can we put photosynthetic activity up there and biodiversity that cleanses and replenishes those 4 elements? So I said, Mr. CEO of an oil company, please, I don't want to have a discussion if we can't at least agree. These are the fundamental things that keep us alive and healthy. Clean air, clean water, clean soil that gives us our food, photosynthesis, and biodiversity. Now, once we agree on that, we can begin to ask, how can we set up an economy that doesn't in any way destroy or diminish those, what I call sacred elements for all of humanity? And we ask, how can we make a living? You see, what I tried to explain to him was, we live in a world that is shaped by laws of nature. Physics informs us that you can't build a rocket that will travel faster than the speed of light. Gravity, the law of gravity, means you can't have an anti-gravity machine here on Earth. And the first and second laws of thermodynamics tell us you can't build a perpetual motion machine. These are all dictated to us by the patterns and the laws that govern life on this planet. And we have to live with that. There's nothing you can do about that. You live within those laws. Chemistry, it's the same. Laws in chemistry determine reaction rates, the kind of elements that can be combined to make molecules, and the diffusion constants. All of these are facts that we understand and live within. And in biology, it's the same. Biology dictates that there is a carrying capacity for a species within ecosystems. Animals like us that aren't bound to specific ecosystems still have limits that are set by the total biosphere. Carrying capacity is something we should pay attention to, because humans, by virtue of our ecological footprint, have far exceeded now the carrying capacity of the biosphere. And we know that biology dictates our absolute need for clean air, clean water, and so on. So I said this is what we have to live within. We can't do anything about those realities that nature, natural law, imposes on us. But then there are other things, borders that we draw around our cities, our provinces, our countries. We are willing to go to war and kill and die to protect these borders. But do you think migrating salmon or caribou or birds or butterflies pay any attention to human boundaries? Nature couldn't care less about human borders, which we create. And then there are other things like capitalism and economies and corporations and markets. These aren't forces of nature. We invented them. And yet now we bow down before them as if they are some kind of force of nature. This is nuts. Those are our opportunity. They can be changed, but they have to be changed to conform to what the laws of nature dictate to us. So this is the challenge. If we go to France in December of next year, are we all going to begin with a standard or a platform of agreement on what the fundamental needs are for our survival and our well-being, our happiness? It seems to me that's pretty obvious that we can get agreement on that. Once we have that agreement, then we can say, how do we modify human behavior and human constructs to in no way diminish those fundamental needs? That's what we've been doing on the Blue Dot Tour now. Spent 7 weeks on a bus. And people say, oh, is this your last tour? You're damn right. It's my last 7-week tour. May make shorter ones, but that's a big one. But we are trying to get this government to go along with what France has already done with their charter on the environment, to enshrine the right to a healthy environment in our Constitution. To say that to be a Canadian means that we will guarantee clean air, clean water, clean soil that gives us our food and biodiversity. And it's a movement that I think certainly on an anecdotal level has been very, very successful, and we'll see how it translates itself in the coming months. But this is the challenge. I hope that gives you some context for the discussions that will go on in Paris in another year. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much again, David. Thank you for your life engagement, reminding us how nature is our reality, our present and our future. This is now the time to introduce you to the panel discussion. I will let the microphone to our CBC journalist moderator, Bob McDonald, and the stage to the 6 panelists for the discussion on climate change and solutions from innovation. And I wish all of you again a great evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob McDonald, and I'm really delighted to be here tonight. And I want to thank France for taking the initiative, a country taking the initiative to say, hey, let's do something about this, a lesson that this country can learn. And we're so glad that they came here for us tonight. And let me start by introducing our French members of the panel. Immediately beside me is Madame Corinne Lepage. She is France's version of Elizabeth May. She founded a Green Party there. And next to her is Valerie Masson-Delmotte. She's a scientist, my favorite kind of person, who is also part of the IPCC report that won the Nobel Prize. That's Valerie. And Danielle Zimmer, he's a technologist, and he'll be talking about realistic technology, green technology that can point the way to a greener future. And it's Danielle. So welcome to our country, and thank you for coming here tonight. And on our Canadian side here, we weren't intending to do this. How did this happen? What about congeniality and all of this? Anyway, faces that I'm sure you know. Dr. Andrew Weaver, right beside me here. Climate scientist, also part of the Nobel Prize-winning IPCC report, now turned politician for the Green Party. Doing an interesting blend of both of those, Andrew. Tom Pedersen, who is he's concerned about the oceans, and he's going to be talking about the impacts here in BC and what it means for this particular province. Tom Pedersen. And Mark Jaccard from Simon Fraser University, who's actually an economist by training, but has a very wonderful environmental bend on how we can do that very challenge that David gave us of blending the economy and the environment. It's Mark Jaccard. Now, you might notice that I'm going a little bit gray, just a bit. I started noticing this morning I'm turning a little gray. Look, I still have black roots. Look, see? What that means is that I've been around for a while. In fact, I've been around just about as long as David has. And my very first job at the CBC was doing a documentary for the program Ideas. It was in 1976, and the program was about climate change. 1976. And back then, the series was called Running Hot and Cold because there was a debate back then whether or not the Earth was going to get cold because we're overdue for an ice age. Warm periods between the ice ages are about 10,000 years long. It's been 12,000 years since the last one, so we're due for a cold period. Then there was another group of scientists saying, what? Who's that? Oh, that's me. Oh, isn't this embarrassing? You know, I don't wear a watch, so I brought my clock with my clock. Anyway, there was another group of scientists saying, well, yeah, that's true, but there's this new stuff called greenhouse gases that we're putting in the atmosphere, and that might overpower this cooling trend, and maybe it'll get warmer. That was 1976. So for 40 years, I've been talking about climate change. And boy, am I tired of it. Tired of talking about it. Let's now get to the point. And we're now at the point where it's no longer something in the future. It's here now, and we're seeing it. So tonight, that's what we're going to talk about, is not just the problem, but what we can do about that problem. So the way this is going to work is that each one of our panelists is going to chat for just a few minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, explaining what their point of view is and what they do. And then after we hear from each one of the panelists, I might have a couple of questions for them, but then we want to open it up to you, because that's really where the evening is going to get interesting. There are microphones at the bottom of the stairs here, and because this is being broadcast, please use the microphones so that the people that are listening from afar can hear it. So keep that in mind, and let us begin our discussion with Valerie Masson-Delmotte.
Good evening. So thank you for the invitation to come back to this beautiful area. So I'm a climate scientist, and I spent the last 21 years working on past climate, understanding past climate, using tree rings, using ice cores, but also using this information to benchmark the exact same climate models that are used for future risks. And this gives a lot of confidence in our ability to understand the basic physics of how the climate system works. And in the last years, with hundreds of other scientists from all over the world, I've contributed to the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. This means a lot of time spent during nights, weekends, to do this work in addition to our normal work, which is to, produce new research and teach. And scientists, they've done their work. And the science is clear. As it was shown in the video, climate is changing, and that's a fact. Most of the changes that we've observed during the past decades, they are due to us. They are due to the growing greenhouse gas emissions, partly compensated by the cooling effect of aerosols. But what we see is only the emerged part of the iceberg. We only see the beginning of the climate response, and the climate trends in the next couple of decades. Their story is already written. It's already in the atmosphere, and we already have a commitment to the continuation of global warming and impacts. We can also look at longer-term scenarios. What if we continue as today? What happens in the business-as-usual scenario? At the end of this century, in this case, the warming would be 5 times larger than what happened during the 20th century. The sea level rate of change could be up to 5 times larger. This means 1 meter more sea level by 2100, and up to 3 meters in the next centuries. That's huge. I come back to my own research as a paleoclimatologist. 4 degrees more. This is unusual on a long-term climate perspective. It means we get out of the range of glacial interglacial changes that were mentioned before. It means also that the rate of change is totally unusual. When we look at these ice ages, the rate of warming was about 1 degree per 1,000 years. We're speaking now of 4 degrees per 100 years. And this is really what makes me extremely concerned about not addressing this issue. And climate change is also a threat for global security. Heat waves, but also very heavy rainfall events, food production, forests. So it's not just a matter of long-term issues, it's a matter of, conditions for our lives. The science is clear. It's policy relevant, but it's not policy prescriptive. So the choices are in your hands, in the hands of our policymakers, and the IPCC is not enough. It's not enough because it's written in a way that makes it very difficult to understand. You heard that language, very likely, medium or high confidence. So we need also to communicate and to share our knowledge in a more understandable way to the general public, to the policymakers, to the CEO of big companies, and to the young generations. And it's also, I think, our duty to enter in the public debate, even when it's difficult. We need to address denial. We need to fight and show what is the state of the science so that there's a really informed debate on how to make progress, how to act. And if we act, and this means reasonable investments, it is feasible, it is still feasible to limit global warming within the 2-degree target that was decided by policymakers. But it means we need to act quickly within the next decades. And finally, what I want to say is, if we do not act now, the burden of mitigation will be tougher. Because if we leave, the runaway increase in greenhouse emissions, it will be more difficult and more expensive to act. And moreover, we leave the burden of adaptation to a constantly moving target to the next generation. I'm a mother of 2 young girls. I cannot accept that. And finally, I think our civilizations, they are built on an alliance between science, innovation, and policy. And it's extremely important to keep this alliance for our sustained development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. Next, I'd like to ask Ted Pedersen for his perspectives.
Thank you, Bob. And bonsoir à tous. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to say just a few words this evening, and I want to focus on the language of climate change and how that's evolved. I want to say a few words about what's happening in British Columbia, and then I'll conclude with just a few thoughts about leadership. But first, let me commend the government of the Republic of France for raising the climate issue to such a position of prominence here, public prominence in Canada. I think I would join with David in saluting the government. Thank you, Andrew. Oh, that makes a big difference. I'd also like to commend President François Hollande for raising the climate issue with our Prime Minister. earlier this month. On November 3rd, in referring to the climate change challenge, he said these words in the House of Commons in Ottawa: "A lack of action will lead to a disaster." We would not have heard the word disaster from a major world leader 10 years ago. The language is changing now as our concern deepens. John Kerry, Secretary of State of the United States, used different words in Indonesia on February 16th. And I quote, "Climate change can now be considered perhaps the world's most fearsome weapon of mass destruction." Now think about that. Here's a major world political figure saying climate change can now be considered perhaps the world's most fearsome weapon of mass destruction. Last month, the Pentagon released its latest report on climate change, and in its foreword, Chuck Hagel, the American Defense Secretary, wrote that, and I quote, "Climate change is a threat multiplier because it has the potential to exacerbate many of the challenges we are dealing with today, from infectious disease to terrorism." We can add that phrase, threat multiplier, to our new climatic vocabulary. So that list now is growing. Mass destruction, disaster, threat multiplier. None of those descriptions or words came from an environmental group. They all came from highly respected political figures. And that concern that's been expressed by those individuals is global. But where the challenge registers for all of us, and all of us in this room tonight, is at the local and the regional scales. And I want to just tell you a few little quick stories about British Columbia. Where I live, which is on Vancouver Island, regional districts and municipalities are now grappling with the reality of rising sea levels. How fast will the sea rise? How far back from the shoreline should new buildings be constructed? These are real questions posed by the people in the front lines. And some of my immediate neighbors who live on the eastern side of the Saanich Peninsula, where I live, on high coastal bluffs, are feverishly working now to limit erosion as the rising seas carve away more of the cliff below their house. For them, for my neighbors, climate change is not some abstract concept, it's real. In the interior of the province, 19 million hectares of forest, that's an area 6 times larger than Vancouver Island, or four times larger than the country of Denmark, has been decimated by the pine bark beetle. We've lost many billions of dollars worth of harvest-ready timber. That infestation relates to warm winters that no longer kill the beetles and have allowed the population to proliferate. And as a result of that, you know, when the Prime Minister of Canada says we can't afford to do anything because acting on climate change will cost the economy, tell that to the logger who's lost his job. Tell that to the truck driver who no longer hauls logs to the sawmill that's now closed. For those communities in the interior of British Columbia, climate change is not an abstraction. It's real. 2 weeks ago, I was in the Yukon in Whitehorse, and there I learned that melting permafrost is causing sections of the Alaska Highway to break up. The additional cost to the Yukon government for highway maintenance is now running about $30,000 per kilometer per year extra above their normal maintenance costs. And so for the highway engineers and for the Yukon government, climate change is not an abstract concept. It's right there in front of them. Their roads are breaking up. Now, British Columbia has been a climate change leader, and several years ago, going back to 2007 or so, we tried and started to do something about it. We declared that we would face head-on the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and 2 of my colleagues on either side of me here, Andrew and Mark, both contributed to developing the policies that British Columbia put in place around that time. In my view, the most important of those was putting a price on carbon dioxide emissions, our fabled BC carbon tax. And that tax is beautiful. I may not get full agreement in this room, but that carbon tax is beautiful. It was so well designed. It started small, $10 per ton of CO2 emitted. It ramped up $5 per ton per year until July 1st of 2012 when it reached $30 per ton. Most people think $30 per ton, that's a big number. Well, in fact, it's 7 cents on a liter of gasoline. That's all. But it's had an impact. We now consume, on a per capita basis, 19% less fossil fuels than the rest of Canada on a per capita basis, thanks to our carbon tax. And that tax has received international acclaim. Paul Ekins, famous environmental economist at the University College London, was appointed by Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of the UK, to lead the Green Fiscal Commission in the United Kingdom some years ago. And Paul describes the structure of the BC carbon tax as, and I quote, a template for the world. And it is. We should be very proud of that. And there's a lot more to the carbon tax. It has been, along with our other climate policies, a great helper to our clean technology sector. David Halliwell, the CEO of Pulse Energy, a young and vigorous and growing Vancouver company, said just a few blocks away in September to a Vancouver audience that British Columbia's reputation as a climate change policy leader reinforced the credibility of his company, of Pulse Energy, as a leader in energy technology and innovation. He would claim that our reputation in this province as a climate leader is helping him in his business. He's not alone in his enthusiasm for the impact of smart climate policies. Our clean technology sector, in fact, is one of the fastest growing branches in our economy. But let me wrap up here with a few points about leadership. We have no scope here for resting on our laurels. We need to redouble our efforts to reduce emissions in British Columbia. But we have new challenges that have arisen here now quite recently, and they're all wrapped around three letters: L, N, and you know what the third one is. How can we continue the crucial task of ratcheting down our emissions while simultaneously pouring more fossil fuel on the global warming fire? That's a big challenge for this province. And it's for that reason that liquefied natural gas and what it means in terms of the value chain in British Columbia is one of the 5 major projects in our research agenda at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. The other 4 are our transportation sector, our building sector, our forestry sector, and prospects for integration of the Western Canadian electrical grid, integrating with our provinces to the east of the Rockies. Each of those projects has a multidisciplinary team of experts from industry, government, and the 4 PICS universities. And the keyword in each one, the focus in each one, is the word solutions. And I'll close by reflecting on what that word solutions means, but I want to turn back to the words of John Kerry in doing that. On April 13th of this year, Kerry said in his response to the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3 report the following: "This report is a wake-up call. It makes it very clear that we face an issue of global willpower, not capacity. Global willpower, not capacity. British Columbia applied willpower in the past. We must make sure that we apply it in the future. France is taking leadership on that front. They're turning the vision of a low-carbon economy progressively into reality. And we can do it too. This is a challenge that we must not fail to meet." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I heard a phrase back when SUVs were first coming on the market, and they were basically just giant trucks with leather seats in them. They were called axles of evil. I like that phrase. Anyway, I'd like to now call on Danielle Zimmer to give us his perspective. Danielle.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm also very pleased to be here in Vancouver for the first time, actually, today or yesterday, to meet our Canadian colleagues and talk about how we want to address collectively climate change issues. And I'm here to talk not so much about climate as a climatologist or a politician, but much more as not an activist, you said a technologist, but I'm actually here to talk about solutions and implementing action and innovation, which is the objective of my organization, Climate KIC. KIC, where KIC stands for Knowledge and Innovation Community. Europe in 2010 decided that it needed to catch up on innovation. we feel that we are lagging behind as compared to the US, to Asia. We lack agility, we lack risk-taking spirit in Europe, and so that's why a number of these KICs have been created. And the objective of these organizations are to create new ecosystems where academia, businesses, public bodies or authorities can meet, can create ecosystems where they can produce new ideas and contribute to innovation. We have been tasked with innovating for low carbon prosperity and a climate resilient society. So we, at the moment, we are a big partnership in Europe of about 250 organizations that are located in 13 different countries. Again, so we have all sorts of organizations, but quite a lot of SMEs, startups, bigger businesses, cities, a lot of research centers working on climate change, but on many different issues. Because climate change is not about climate only, it's about all activities that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, for instance. We work on cities, on buildings, on circular economy, on bioeconomy, and on greenhouse gas monitoring, reporting. We have also programs on dealing with adaptation, with land and water issues. And not last but not least, we have a big activity on transitions, because we are convinced that whatever the technologies, the solutions that you develop, you need to bring them to the society. You need to create new markets also for them, and for this you need to change quite often the behavior of the people. You need to create new financial models. You need to also remove political or regulatory barriers in order to deploy these innovations. So we are trying to tackle all these issues, and that's why we need to be quite a large partnership. Our ultimate goals are to create jobs, to show also that tackling climate change is not just about destroying the economy, but creating a new economy. And the second objective is, of course, to reduce emissions and also increase the resilience of our societies. So we are creating at the moment a framework to also evaluate, monitor how effective we are in achieving these goals. Basically, the way also we function, we have we start with education, because education is really fundamental. We need new innovators. We need to take students to the new world that we want to build, and for this we have created specific programs where students go from have a journey in Europe in different areas, and after 6 months of teaching, coaching, they are requested to propose the concept for a new startup, and we finance the best ones. We also create teaching programs and training programs for practitioners and for senior people in public and private organizations. We have also a big clean tech program where we accelerate startups, where we support SMEs. So this is also one of our success stories. We have supported up to 300 startups, which are picked in Europe in the most promising areas that are related to climate, and we also support them and help them pass the valley of death, and then get funding from different VCs or different innovation funds. And finally, we try to create this an ecosystem where new ideas can be brought and transformed into new products and services that we 10 we try to deploy in Europe, and more globally we are now working also in Africa, in Brazil, and start also to do things in Asia. So a few lessons that we have learned from our program. First of all, a lot is already happening. That is maybe a positive thing, but I'm personally impressed when I see the number of startups that are creating amazing instruments that often the bigger companies have not even imagined to create. For instance, to charge electric vehicles in Europe, these are really startups who are creating the tools to recharge the batteries of electric vehicles. For me, it was a surprise, but BMW uses the services of a very small startup to help its network of electric cars expand. What we see also is that local authorities are among the drivers, as well as many businesses. They are doing a lot of things, and what is needed is not so much to develop new things, but to help scale up and deploy these tools, services that are being developed. And for this, we need to remove quite a number of barriers, and this is really a very tricky point at the moment. And what we are, for instance, for COP21, we are contributing to a report with other, especially with businesses who are looking at new energy systems or new vehicles. And the message is everywhere. Technology is not the issue. There are a lot of things. What is important is at the moment to create new value chains and remove barriers in order to deploy these innovations. And if you take the car industry, you don't need to necessarily only to produce cars, but you need to start with the charging of the batteries. You need to look at how to use your cars in a different way, have car sharing mechanisms, but also have a sort of recycling program, because if you want electric cars to be scaled out, you need to give confidence to the car owners that they will be able to sell their cars after 3-4 years as well. So it's an entire chain that needs to be put in place, and this is, of course, not only the big industry. You need a lot of competencies to be articulated to create these new value chains that are necessary for the new economy that we need. All this will be probably disruptive. We see that the new way of producing, consuming, recycling create a new way of and a new economy. And this needs to be, we need to accept in advance that this will be disruptive and that there will be things that will change significantly in our societies. So what do we need? And I will also maybe give the floor then to our policy speakers. What do we need from policymakers? Yes, first of all, it's very important that policymakers give us or agree on a number of targets. Targets at least give a sort of inspiration. They show where we want to go, and in this way they are very important. But I would like to second also what Professor David Suzuki told us. Targets are in a way very comfortable for politicians. It's comfortable to set targets that will be achieved in 20 years' time. We need also the politicians in this removal of barriers, in the creation of levers to innovation, and in really transforming these targets into concrete action plans that will help societies to transform these targets into real action. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Boy, the change always happens from the ground up, and it's a little... People don't talk about the fact that going green actually makes money, usually, in business. I would like now to call on Mark Jaccard.
Thank you. My talk follows nicely on yours. I was worried, actually, that you were going to simply tell us about these exciting possibilities without going into, as you did at the end, what needs to happen. And I think I need to take that even a little bit further. And I'm going to do that by just, first of all, when we say we need innovation, do we need innovation? Sure, of course we need innovation. But what kind and how? So we often think about innovation and we associate it with, as of course this European initiative is, we associate it with driving down the cost of alternative energies, of solar and wind, and we see this all the time. And we have this idea that if we can just drive down those costs, what is the thing I often hear when I'm with advocates? It's we're going to beat fossil fuels in 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years, something like that. The message to the politician then is, oh good, I just stay out of the way. I relieve a few barriers, but that's kind of it. Well, there's those of us, and my work is in the economics of sustainable energy, and a lot of work, I don't do research on innovation, but I end up having to follow that very closely. I model innovation ideas and evidence. Are we missing something? Where's innovation happening? There is a tremendous amount of innovation going on all the time with fossil fuels, like a tremendous amount. And 30 years ago, when I started my career, we were told something in the energy field very different from what peak oil people will tell you, or you've probably heard peak gas, peak coal. They say, well, we're going to run out of this stuff. That's not what I was taught. I was taught and shown evidence that the Earth's crust is chock-a-block full of fossil fuels, and that humans are very innovative, and that fossil fuels are a wonderful form of energy. They're fantastic. It's this chemical, it's stored solar energy, and very high density, very high quality. And human beings have discovered that. And now what are they doing? They're innovating how to get at even more of it. And so it doesn't even matter if they seem to be running out of conventional oil or conventional natural gas. They just keep moving along with innovation. About $100 billion a year invested in innovation and exploration for more fossil fuels. So my point is simply that it isn't just about relieving some barriers. The innovation that will happen is going to be very dramatic, and we have all the evidence right in front of us. I had heard about fracking 25 years ago. Fracking didn't happen because we had a lot of conventional gas. Its time would come, and more innovation driving down its cost. Oil sands, we knew about it forever. But then it got its chance with innovation. Now we're seeing this with tight oil in the United States. There's gas hydrates, there's coal bed methane. There's just huge amounts of fossil fuels in the Earth's crust. So what does this say for innovation? It says that we have to remember that even while we're driving down through subsidies, programs, barrier removals, helping with the valley of death for new technologies, that in fact, that will also drive innovation and drive down the price of fossil fuels. People today talk about a high price of oil. Well, they're starting to see it slip again. I'm amazed when I ask people just at large, what was the average price of oil between 1986 and 2002? That's a 16-year period. Well, it turns out it was under $25. So could it go down there again? Absolutely. Would it go down there if we were developing non-fossil fuel forms of energy that were replacing it and therefore decreasing the demand? Yes, it would, because the very low-cost possibilities for fossil fuels would still be there. So what's the lesson from this? And I'll conclude with that. This is the difficult part for all of us, but we don't have to be policy wonks like me, but you've got to be putting pressure on policy to happen. And right now, and so for example, how many people know right now that we elected a government in British Columbia that is unraveling our climate policies? Now, Andrew might speak more about this because Andrew wrote a beautiful, what was that? It was just in your blog or? Yeah, and which sort of had me crying because I was working with him when we put those in place. But just to give you some examples, we have a zero emission electricity policy. I was lead author for sustainable policies in the global energy assessment, and I was so proud. I wasn't proud of the carbon tax. The zero emission electricity regulation swamps the carbon tax in terms of it's prevented. BC Hydro had contracts with 2 coal companies to build coal plants to make electricity. It had big projects for natural gas. What is the provincial, with that policy that we brought in 2007, all of that was stopped. You couldn't do a project that caused greenhouse gas emissions. Now what's happening? The government is saying, well, if we're emitting greenhouse gases and it's to make LNG to send to China, then it's not really a greenhouse gas. So CO2 is not CO2. What are they doing with, and of course with the carbon tax, they froze that. And now what we're hearing about is that we actually had enabling legislation for cap and trade. And people will get excited that cap and trade, carbon tax, regulation, I believe in all of them. I believe in not fighting about any of them. So we have an opportunity eventually to join Quebec and California in an absolute type of cap and trade, where emissions will go down. And as I've learned through reading and I hope I'm not stealing anything you're going to say, what Andrew had pointed out was that the new legislation copies the Alberta cap and trade, which is a sneaky kind of cap and trade that says $15 per ton, but actually that's just for the small amount that they do in excess of what they were allowed to do. And so it works out to $2 a ton instead of BC's $30 a ton or the $15 as announced in Alberta. Well, guess what? British Columbia is putting in legislation to follow the Alberta model instead of the Quebec, California, or European model of an absolute cap. So that's going on right now while we live in this jurisdiction. And finally, what we need governments to do is to say, in a world in which we were all acting, tell us, you independent people in the work of energy, would we be expanding an oil pipeline now as part of the 2 degrees Celsius limit? And I can tell you that any independent energy economists in the world, and I think right now of the major 8 modeling teams around the world, all say you're not expanding unconventional oil like oil sands, and so you're not building pipelines in that world. And so, and right now, I know this is nonpartisan, and I am nonpartisan, or not nonpartisan in the Vancouver sense, but we have an election right now in which stopping a pipeline is a big issue in that election, and I hope people are informed of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, to continue the policy discussion, let's get the perspective from France. Madame Corinne Lepage.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to be in Vancouver for the first time and in this evening too. I was Minister of Environment in 1995 when IPCC presented the second report. At this moment, a few people knew the document and less decided to act. 15 years after, during 5 years, as member of European Parliament, I assisted to the COP, Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, Doha, Warsaw, and no real progress. The COP21 is the last moment to find an agreement at the universal level. The climate change is a fact. Climate skepticism is an opinion, and the blindness a mistake. For beginning, I want to explain briefly, the position of EU, the cap of the EU. In 2028, the European Commission proposed binding legislation to the 2020 targets. The climate energy package was agreed by the European Parliament and Council in December 2008 and became law in June 2009. All the engagement are not very well met, but we are in progress. Recently, the European Parliament adopted a roadmap for 2030, cut off 40% of greenhouse gas emission, 40% increase of efficiency, and 30% of renewable energy. The Council reduced the targets, but we have a minimum. Today, China and United States announced an agreement to reduce their emissions. It's an absolute needing. As Ban Ki-moon says, there is no plan B because it is not planet B. We have to obtain an agreement in Paris next year for two reasons. First reason is moral, second reason is economic. First reason, because it's our responsibility. 2 generations have created the problem, but all the new generations have to support the consequence of our development. We have the problem, we have to put the solution. It's a question of survival for the long term. Second reason is naturally economics. In the short term, because the green economy and third industrial revolution are the most efficient way to create jobs, value, social equity. The future is not the industry of the 19th century, but the 21st century. In the medium term, the first firms and countries in the market take the biggest part of value and create the norm. It's the interest. In the long term, mitigation and adaptation go together to protect people, to cut external costs that we discover every day on health, water, air quality, food, etc. We have to be coherent and take most quickly the good way. Personally, I am inquired with a project of free trade agreement which want to reduce the norms of pollution, health and environment in Europe. Why? Because that will be more expensive after. It's the same for the choice in favor for sand or nuclear. Short-term advantage could be a sharp break after. But, in my opinion, the most important stay in the public opinion, the consumers, the students, the interest of business for the new economy and the innovation, the good innovation, and the understanding of the urge to act. It's my principal occupation today. I'm convinced we can find in the transition enthusiastic motivation. I know that in your province, here today, you are a lot to share this opinion. And finally, I hope that in Paris, in November 2015, British Columbia and Quebec position can inspire Canada position. It inspires Canada to compete every day for the fossil of the day in Paris.
Thank you, Madame Lepage. And finally, the person who's been wiggling in his seat here all night, just waiting to talk, Andrew Weaver.
Thank you very much. Before I start, in the field of climate science, there's a very important term called climate sensitivity. then by definition, climate sensitivity is the amount of warming that would arise if we doubled atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from pre-industrial times. In 1979, I graduated from high school, and at that time, a report was released by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences called the Charney Report. The best estimate of climate sensitivity, according to the scientific literature at the time, was a range between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. In 1990, the first IPCC assessment report was released. The best estimate of climate sensitivity was between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. I just started at McGill at that time. In 1995, the first time I was involved in the IPCC writing process, the climate sensitivity was again estimated from all the papers around the world, and the best estimate was between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. In 2001, we're now at the third assessment report of the IPCC, and the best estimate of climate sensitivity came at, you guessed it, between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. We have the 2007 report, and then last year, in 2013, the fifth, that's the fourth time I've been involved, the fifth IPCC assessment report was released, and the best estimate of the amount of warming from doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from pre-industrial times was between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. That's 35 years of the same number from many, many thousands of studies. You know, the science is in. We really are, in the scientific community, still doing important questions in science, but not fundamental questions as to defining the problem, what's causing it, and what needs to be done if we want to deal with it. Two really illustrative examples are as following. Let's suppose we have the hypothetical, two scenarios of future emissions that are based on realistic projections of technological change, energy use, population growth, etc. And I look at the differences between these two projections, one that's very fossil fuel intensive and one that's not 20 years from now. Well, if I look at the maps, it's very difficult for me to discern a difference between the projected change in the climate over the next decade or so because of infrastructure inertia in our socioeconomic systems that mean we're going to be doing more of the same no matter, even as we transition. But if I looked at the end of this century, in one path I might see warming globally of around 1.8 degrees, and in another I might see over 4 degrees. And that actually, in essence then, boils the entire question of global warming down to one. And it points out to the barriers in terms of dealing with it. The question is this: do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment and the planet that they inherit? Many of us, I think most of us, would say yes, but there may be some who say no. But that is, in essence, the real question that's wrapped around the global warming issue. Because decisions made today are not going to be lived by those making the decisions. The consequences of these decisions bear out on the next generation. But that generation is not part of our decision-making process. Therein lies a political conundrum. Because if I'm a politician, well, I am now, but I've given a lot of talks where historically I would say that, and at some point you realize that, I'll quote Emma Watson later, but you have to step up. But a politician, many people are often thinking about re-election in 4-year political cycles. So you think about putting in place policy measures that 4 years from now you can point to and say, look, I listened to you, the electorate, this is what I did, vote me back in. For example, I see a few gray hairs out here. There's probably a number of people there who are contemplating hip or knee replacements. And, as somebody who needs a knee replacement, you're living in pain. Imagine a politician who says, I'm going to reduce hip replacement lineups by 2 years to 3 months. 4 years from now, they can point to that and say, look, I listened to you. Vote me back in. And you do. Because you're thinking about the short-term consequences of the decisions being made. But what about the leaders who actually say, you know what, I'm going to put in aggressive policy measures to actually think about reducing emissions over the long term such that your children's children will have a very different world from the one that would otherwise occur? Well, it's hard to get quick votes. That is the fundamental problem that we have with our political systems, is that because of the short-term electoral cycles. In terms of dealing with it, I'll conclude with this. There are really, all the solutions are there. The barriers are not technological. The barriers are not behavioral. The barriers, I would argue, and I believe my colleagues to the right and left would argue, are ones about internalizing externalities in the language of Jaccard. That is, paying the true costs of your behavior. It is in every single person, in every single house, in every single municipality, in every single city, in every single province, in every country in the world's best financial interest to do absolutely nothing about global warming. Because the costs of action are borne by the individual, and the costs of inaction are distributed amongst 7 billion people. And there's 3 ways you can do this. And you can, the analogy is, I quite like, is think of a big pond, and there's a bunch of fish in the pond. And think about a fisher going there to pick a fish. It's in each of our interests to take as many fish out, because we reap the benefits of the fish entirely, but any costs of overfishing are distributed amongst all of them. So in order to stop the inevitable collapse, the tragedy of the commons, you can do one of 3 things. You could elect some benevolent people to regulate how many fish can take out. You could put a price on fish and regulate the number of fish that are taken out based on increasing or reducing the price on fish. You can cap the number of fish taken out and change the cap to allow it to go up or down as you determine whether or not overfishing is occurring. 3 means of dealing with the problem. The analogy is direct to the climate system, cap and trade, carbon tax, regulation. Without these 3, without the political will to actually introduce these 3, frankly, it's political courage too, and political leadership to do this, we will not deal with this problem. So ultimately, it comes down to the voter. And I don't want this to be political, but when 70 to 80% of people over the age of 65 vote, and only 30 to 40% of youth vote, you have to ask the question, why? Because the youth are going to live the consequences of the decisions being made, yet they're not participating in our democratic systems to elect those who will make the decisions that have their best interests at heart. This is a tragedy. And to quote finally Emma Watson, in a different context she did this, and ultimately that's why I stepped up to do this and why I hope there's others who will be out here as well. She says as following, with the context of violence against women internationally, spoken recently at the U.S. Summit. If not me, who? If not now, when? And with that, I'll thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. Now that you've heard their points of view, I invite you to come up to the microphones at the bottom of the stairs here, and we would like to hear your points of view. Let's bring the lights up so that we on the stage can see who you are. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, I have a question that I'd like to throw out to the entire panel. And it has to do with this recent announcement with China and the United States coming together. I want to ask the panel what... We're going to run the microphones. Oh, we're going to run the mics? Oh, you can't? Oh, okay. So how do we do it? We're going to run them up and down the stairs for you. Okay. Yep. So let me get to my question. Just so you know. So first of all, can someone characterize what that is, just as a review for what that agreement was? And my supplemental, and I'm not supposed to ask double questions in my business, but how realistic is it, and what impact will it have? I open that to the panel. So can somebody just, first of all, just characterize the deal? Mark?
Sure. I mean, information's still just trickling out, but what we've been trying to say, I mean, even in negotiations way back when, that rich countries need to have their emissions start to fall right away, and developing countries need to have some slack and then have their emissions falling. And this agreement, and that was implicit in Kyoto and in earlier things, agreements that were discussed. And this agreement puts that in place. The United States has their emissions going down. The United States said its emissions would fall 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. Stephen Harper said, "Oh, I'll match that." The Americans are going to achieve it. We've done nothing in Canada to achieve it, and now it's too late, actually. We cannot achieve that target 5 years from now. But so what the Americans do is they'll extend now beyond 2020, and I think it takes them, this is where I could be wrong, to 2030, or it's like 2035 or something like 2025 to be more like 25%, 28%. 26% below their 2005 levels. Meanwhile, the Chinese agree that their emissions would start to rise at a slower rate, which they've already started to do, and peak around 2030 and then start to fall. So I would just say that, in my view, this is really big news. And the other reason, unlike Stephen Harper promising something like this, the Chinese at Copenhagen put in a target that a lot of us were not happy with because they said, well, our emissions will go down in intensity. They meant that their GDP will still go up and their emissions will go up, but their emissions per unit GDP will fall. And people like me said, wow, it's actually going to fall almost at the rate that we expected anyway, just from general efficiency. But the Chinese were being honest, right? So unlike, they made a promise and they're going to keep it. And that kind of encourages me when they come through with a promise like this. I think there's great potential for them to keep it.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now, what about my second part of the question? How realistic is this, and what do we think?
Thank you. I think it's realistic. If the business want, and that is the problem, because nobody speak on the question of lobbies, but it is a big problem for the negotiation. But I think that the agreement is important for the negotiation because the balance between countries in the negotiation, Lima or Paris, it's the same, depend a lot of the position of China, because China is the leader for the 77 group. And if China is in the good move, I think that it's possible to train the other country. And if states are the new position, perhaps can develop countries as Canada or Australia change their position. But I am not sure. It's an opinion.
Either are we. Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment. So the target that was put forward in the press from the US is a reduction of emissions by 26% compared to 2005 in 2030. Their emissions have increased by about 15% from 1990 to 2005. So you can see the amount of engagement. You can compare with the European commitment of 30% less compared to 1990. And the efforts that we are committed to in Europe is huge because we start from low greenhouse gas emissions. So I really believe that there's a whole margin for progress in high-emitting countries.
Yeah, just also one comment. I also believe that this is rather realistic in terms of target. But I also believe that politicians and Chinese and US politicians give their sort of symbol of and a signal that agreements can be reached even bilaterally. But it's, I think, a very good signal that can maybe pave the way to other agreements on the road to Paris next year. And I think the world is at the moment looking for these signals that give at least an idea of we can go there and we can we can have commitments even before Paris and see what comes out then during the COP in 2015.
Thank you. Do you want to comment? Okay.
I'll just add that one thing that's really important here is whether or not it's realistic. I think it probably is realistic, but what's really important about this is it's an example of leadership. And I think that Presidents Obama and Xi Jinping to come forward after 9 months of essentially secret negotiations and announce this at the APEC meeting is a tremendous signal to the rest of the world. It puts tremendous pressure, I think, on the government of Canada, the government of Australia, and quite a number of others around the world. And I think it's good news. I just hope that it is realistic and that they follow through.
Thank you very much. Gentleman with a question over here.
Yes, thank you all for coming. I'm so glad that you brought up this question of this announcement just recently. I've spent quite a lot of time in China in the last little while, and I think the impression you get there that certainly the upper levels of the Chinese government really thinks this is very important. I would like to emphasize, though, not just this recent announcement, but the one that happened in New York a little while ago, where the leader of the Chinese delegation said, in part of his discussion, we are doing this not because outside people want us, because we see it to our advantage. Now that's changed the whole pattern. It's not, we're waiting for you, it's, we're going to get there first, you'd better rush to catch up. So my question is a little different than perhaps you would expect. I think that one of the important roles of government in the scramble to change that I see coming, the avalanche of change, will be in the matter of standards. That there'll be a lot of snake oil peddled. Everything will be green, and now everything will be energy saving, and a lot of it won't be. Where are the governments of Canada and France preparing to have good tests to measure the performance of solar panels or electric cars or all of the new things that will be coming out in huge diversity of design and materials, and some will be better and some won't, and we'll need to know how to proceed. Otherwise, we're going to end up making corn ethanol, which was 100 times worse than solar cells, batteries, and electric cars.
Okay, thank you for that. How do we prevent greenwashing? Does anyone like to take that? Marie?
So just one quick comment. So in France, we have an energy agency that is already providing independent assessment of performance for different aspects. It can be cars, it can be insulating material, and solar panels as well. So there's already a process for certification. And we also have official certification for many aspects, like electrical tools used at home. We have certification supervised by the government. So I'm sure this will be reinforced for the energy transition.
In Europe, we have a system to monitoring, to monitor the emission. But this point is very important because it was a fail point between China and the States last year in the COP, the last COP, because China don't want that it was possible to monitor the emission because they're afraid that other control were induced. And states say it's impossible to take an agreement if it's impossible to control. And we don't have solution. And I hope that they find a solution on this point, because if not, it's greenwashing, and it would be very difficult to have a binding engagement, because it's if we don't have control, we cannot. Every people, every country can say everything, but nobody say if it's true or not.
Brilliant.
Could I very quickly?
Sure.
Very quickly, I don't think at a widget level it's of great concern in Canada. We have the same standards and the same regulations. Where it's of concern is at the political level, where politicians will say to you what they want, what you want to hear, but do precisely the opposite. There's a lot of rhetoric out there, a lot of language saying we're doing this, we're cleanest that, we're doing this, green that, and it's not. There is the problem, I think, that we have to hold our elected leaders accountable. The market will take care of those people trying to pull a fast one on the consumer and punish the producer of such widgets.
You mean like calling LNG clean energy? Yeah.
Well, exactly.
It's also a phrase, you can't polish a turd.
I mean, We've got clean coal. We've got cleanest LNG. We've got Canada saying we are regulating sector by sector. There's so many examples of that. Ethical oil.
Great phrases. Danielle, just one last comment?
Yeah, very quick comment. Indeed, it's not only a problem of standardization. It's really these monitoring, reporting, verification of emissions that is very important. In our program, we have a specific group working on these issues, and we are starting with the development of sensors. We continue with monitoring programs. We also have the possibility to work with SMEs who are developing new methods to validate their approaches. And on top of this, every project that we are developing is we are developing a methodology to really look at the carbon emissions, or at least the benefits that each project that we are developing will likely bring to the emissions. So this is really very much something that we are developing, and we'll see whether this will become standard. But it's fundamental that we go in that direction.
Thank you. Next question. Up here. Yes.
Hi there. It's Nicholas Heap from Vancouver. I want to thank the government of France and SFU for putting on this event and having such a great range of speakers. It's been wonderful. I do have a question. The federal government of Canada, I think it's safe to say that it's been actively unhelpful on the climate change file. My question is as a minor major country or a major minor country, what is the ability of a similarly intransigent federal government in November, December 2015? What is its ability to affect a global agreement on climate change? Is our federal government, is that a Canadian problem, or is this actually a global issue, and what can we as citizens do about that?
Is there a politician in the room?
There was two parts to that. First of all, Canada is not a bit player in terms of the global emissions. I think we're the 8th largest overall emitter as a country, ahead of many European nations with much larger populations and other jurisdictions too. People don't listen to Canada much now on the international scene. However, UNFCCC rules and regulations, there will require some ratification process. But again, Canada's lost credibility on that too, because we are the only country to actually ratify and subsequently pull out of the Kyoto. We've done similar things now with the desertification UN trade UN agreement. So the bad news is that Canada is not listened to as much as it used to be, because it's got such a bad rap on many of these issues, unfortunately. But the good news is the world can go on and Canada will come kicking or screaming. The problem with Canada, from a Canadian perspective, is that we've gone all in on a 20th century economy. We're going all in on assets that may be stranded, that there may not be a market for, and we have no plan B. And this is, folly. We have no... Look around the world at other jurisdictions that had fossil fuel reserves and exploited them and put aside some money for tomorrow, for the next generation, and position themselves for tomorrow with the wealth of today. We've got a absolutely zero in the bank, and we have no plan to actually save anything. So it's folly and it's dangerous, and frankly, it's sad that BC is following the precise same path, if you ask me.
Thank you, Andrew.
Bob, can I just...
Sure, Mark.
As we move towards global action, hopefully soon, of a serious nature, it's likely that there will be tariffs applied by different countries, and they will either be World Trade Organization compliant, or the rules of the World Trade Organization will change. But that will happen because not all humans, through their governments, are going to want to act equally, whether it's Russia or whomever. You won't get a deal. You will use tariffs. So every bill that's been contemplated in the U.S. and one that was passed by the House of Representatives and almost passed the Senate was called the Waxman-Markey Bill. It was like all those other bills. It had conditions in there that said if other countries that we're trading with 10 years down the road still haven't implemented policies that have a similar effect of regulating or pricing carbon pollution, then we are going to have to require them through either a direct tariff or the person importing Chinese goods, for example, if they have high emissions, would have to get permits associated with the emission intensity of producing those goods. So I would argue that any government, like Canada, can't prevent this from going ahead at a global scale if enough powerful countries want it to happen.
Thank you. Where's our next microphone? I'm sort of following the microphone. Keep your hands up if you do have a question. Up here, yes.
Yes, I have a question. Naomi Klein stated in her book that laissez-faire capitalism is a systemic barrier to the world providing solution to global climate change. So how can we come up with a solution for climate change when capitalism is a dominant ideology in running the world economy?
Okay. Did everyone hear the question? Yeah. Okay. So how do we beat the inertia in place, which is already mentioned here tonight, of the capitalistic system, which is based on growth? Yeah. Tom?
I haven't had an opportunity to read Naomi Klein's book yet, but I will say that I don't think it's capitalism that's the problem here; it's corporatism. And the issue really is that large governments, and we can trade names if you like, have become pretty much at the mercy of the large funders of certain political forces within societies. And that's certainly true in the United States now. We saw it in the midterm elections last week. To some degree, it's becoming a phenomenon here in Canada. And I think that that's what we need to avoid. I don't think capitalism itself is failing. I think it's corporatism that's failing.
Thanks, Tom.
I have read Naomi Klein's book, and I think that the evidence, so this relates to the point I made earlier about fossil fuels being really a Faustian issue for humanity. We have had enormous benefits from fossil fuels, and we're having a lot of trouble pushing away from them. And if you watch what China did over the last 20 years, and now India is asking, what are we supposed to do over the next 20 years? Fossil fuels were the cheaper option, and that's what I'm trying to point out. And so I would argue that the evidence is pretty strong that climate change and humanity's inability to deal with a global scale problem like this is a problem for communism, socialism, anarcho-syndicalism. And what I seem to find in her book was the idea that we would all be small communities and we wouldn't trade energy anymore. And there are a lot of attractive benefits to that, and that we wouldn't have, I don't know, much private property, at least in the energy sector. It would be communally owned. Perhaps, and that's actually called autarkic communalism. And it means that you're not trading with anyone, and you produce everything locally. It's like the 100-mile diet. There are a lot of arguments for that. But it will be costlier because fossil fuels are so fantastic if you can flip them around the planet. And we, in the rich countries, are able to start walking away from that. This is going to be very difficult for developing countries. It's the cheapest way. It was the cheapest way for China to get electricity to 200 million people that didn't have it 15 years ago.
Thanks, Brian.
A quick comment as well to this. What we see at the moment is that the financial sector is getting more and more conscious of the risks of the of global of climate change, and they are, and many funds or investors or pension funds are very, very much trying to act, and disinvestment policies are also put in place by some of these funds who want to at least see their investments be less connected to CO2 emissions, basically, because not so much, of course, because of their altruist positions, but because they see that investments that are too much connected to emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are a threat to the performance of their portfolios. So we are at the moment also creating a number of indices and support tools for investment funds, and we see more and more investment funds coming and willing to take action to prevent and to ensure the performance of their portfolio.
The other part of the economy that's responding is the insurance companies, as they're saying, hey, we're paying for climate change and we just don't want to do that anymore. They can hold the whole world ransom. I want to ask the panel one question that came in by Twitter. What are the contingency plans if the 2015 Paris talks fail to establish a robust and enforceable agreement? What happens if Paris is a failure? We've seen failures before.
I don't have the answer, but but I think that it's not possible to continue meeting after meeting without solution. If it's not possible to have an agreement, a serious agreement in Paris, I think that we had to think the problem differently, not at the international level, but perhaps regional level, and at the level of civil society, because it's very important that green business, new technology, good technology, but new technology, new communication technology, all this world can work together, and today it's possible with internet. And I think that if policymakers are unable to find a solution, the society find another solution, because it's our life of all the people, and it's impossible to stay in this position. I think that other people find other solutions.
Not quite sure what those are. That's the question. So, Mark?
So there are a lot of people who've been thinking about this for a long time, and there's a lot of literature on this. And even when the process, which the French are working so hard, and we had some good discussions today about strategies that one would follow in the lead up to Paris so that it won't fail. But a recognition that sort of 20 years of failure and what were the causes for that is certainly something that is an exercise that one should be engaged in. And of course, a lot of people are. And what they've tried to do is look at other models. So what is the model that we've kind of agreed on? It's a United Nations model trying to see consensus among people from countries with incredibly different interests, whether they are rich, low-lying countries, up in the north, wherever. And there are a whole bunch of good reasons why humanity won't be able to do something together on that. So people look at other cases where broader agreements were built. I mean, you can even look at something like the start of the European Union. It was 3 countries making a steel pact: France, Germany, and Italy. There were people who had a dream. In fact, the 3 key people in that had a dream of all of Europe, political, equity-focused, environmental-focused, not just a free trade kind of agreement. And they got there, but they got there by bits and pieces. And that's why an agreement between China and the United States can be very important. It's why Quebec linking up with the California cap and trade can be very important. It's a model of 2 subnational entities within North America saying, look, this can be done. It can be cross-border, and it can work. And those are the kind of things we really need. Right now in Canada, the thing that I think we need most is to have Ontario join that system. And we should have British Columbia joining that system. Very difficult. But it will be it could be something like a steel agreement internationally, or coal-fired electricity generation, vehicle technologies. So it could be sectoral, or it also could be bunches of countries, and there are people talking and working about that. Something you might want to read is David Victor's book called Global Gridlock, as an example. He looks at a lot of possibilities.
Okay. Marie?
Hello. What I think on my side is that, for Copenhagen, what was put forward was save the planet or nothing, and the chance for failure was very high. So for Paris, what I expect is a list of maybe 20 points. 20 points where we know agreement is feasible, and against these 20 precise points, you can measure progress of the COP21, and then you can report. It will not solve all the issue with controlling climate change, but it will, show which transition is being made, and as was said before, with the local areas, not only at the national level, and with different sectors. So that's really, personally, what I expect. A pragmatical way.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. Person who has the mic. Yes, hi.
Yes, hello. It's been a very interesting conversation to listen to, and I really appreciate it. I'd like to highlight a couple of the points that I've heard, and one has to do with building infrastructure. Another has to do with energy policy and forward-looking energy policy. And another has to do with the huge costs of biodiversity loss and how that impacts climate change. And I'd like to draw your attention to an example of crazy thinking that we have in British Columbia right now, and that is the contemplation of building Site C Dam. And the ability of the government to make a decision on this without public process is a shame. But what I'd like to say is that one of the costs that's not necessarily understood is the $8 billion that Site C Dam is estimated to cost will divert all sorts of economic energy away from innovation and away from our ability to put in place real innovative solutions. And I'm wondering...
So what is your question?
Well, I'm wondering if my dream is crazy. And my dream is that along the Peace River, we'd have solar panels, we'd have wind turbines, and we'd be building geothermal energy sources rather than flooding a valley to produce electricity to power one LNG plant. Right. Is that a crazy dream, or is it possible?
Tom?
I don't think it's a crazy dream. I think the key question that we have to ask is that our society needs energy. How are we going to provide that energy? If you look at what's happening now, and you've alluded to solar cells and wind turbines and so on, the price of solar cells has fallen from something like $80 a watt when Andrew was still in high school to 62 cents a watt now. Imagine that. In just his lifetime, we've gone... What about their lifetime? We've gone from $80 a watt to 60-something cents a watt. So that's actually cost competitive now with new hydropower. The difference, of course, is the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so you have to make accommodations for that. Wind power, same thing. The cost now of installing offshore wind power, which used to be prohibitively expensive, has come rocketing down. And and Nick Heaps is in the audience here, he can tell you all about this. He's with the Canadian Wind Energy Association. That if you want to establish wind turbines now in an offshore wind farm in Hecate Strait, which is one of the best sites in the world because the wind almost always blows there. It has what we call a capacity factor of about 60%. Again, it's cost competitive with Site C. So should we really be talking Site C when we have these options? But we still have to accommodate the fact that the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. But the beauty of that in British Columbia is that we have 27 large batteries out there. They're called dams. And every one of those dams can be used as a battery to provide firming power for wind or solar when needed. And we need to work very actively now to see how much of an accommodation of renewables that we can actually accomplish.
I don't think we'll see Site C come to fruition for reasons that have nothing to do with energy production, but simply because The government is going to incur, it's not $8 billion debt, it'll end up being over $10 billion debt, which will put at risk its AAA credit rating. And when you put your AAA credit rating at risk, you potentially put all your debt servicing up. This government's been very proud of its balanced budget. If you are starting to take another $10 billion on public, it's through Crown Corporation, but it'll still be viewed as public debt. There's a problem. So I think that is a barrier of why it will not actually be approved. It's sitting at Cabinet, and the decisions at Cabinet right now are specifically along those lines. It's not the most cost-effective solution, and I suspect it will not be approved. But I'm not privy to Cabinet discussions until 2017.
Thank you very much. This is a question from someone in the lobby. There's an overflow audience outside. In light of this panel discussion, I view the problem analogous to our human addiction to sugar and our consumption of fossil fuels. Can we relate to this in terms of climate change? Addiction to oil and addiction to fossil fuels.
Yes, we need a low-carb diet.
Very good. Addiction. Okay. Our next question. That was good. Hi.
Hello, I've got a comment and a question. I've just recently come from a small country, New Zealand, where I work for the Chief Science Advisor to the New Zealand Prime Minister, and last year wrote a report on climate change and the effects for New Zealand. So one of the comments was really to a question earlier on what can a smaller country do in the face of a larger neighbour. So in the Copenhagen summit, New Zealand initiated an initiative called the Alliance on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, and I think that's an example where in a sector-based, in a specific area which is of importance, a small country which incidentally has almost exactly the same population as British Columbia can make a difference on a global stage. So I do think it's possible. Second one comes back to a point that Valerie made about uncertainty and the IPCC, the commentary there about likely, least, and not likely, etc. I have a question for the panel. How can we better communicate uncertainty to the general public and improve understanding in both directions? I think it's a key problem that has arisen throughout, has led to some big misunderstandings of things like the hiatus.
Thank you very much for that question. That's a good point on how does the science actually work? What does uncertainty mean?
We looked backwards. What is the flood of the century? What is the hurricane of the century? You look backwards, you look at what happened in a given area. But with increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, new risks are ahead of us. A warmer atmosphere contains 7% more moisture, per degree warming. So the risk of heavy rainfall is different in a warmer climate than in a pre-industrial climate. So when we look at the future, what should we plan for? Of course, the uncertainty is larger because the events that happened in the past could happen in the future, but new events will also happen. So for me, basically, intrinsically, a changing climate means a larger uncertainty, not for us as scientists, but for the society to adapt to.
Well, I like to sum up scientific uncertainty with this issue as follows. I say, look, we have uncertainty about turbulence closure theory, but that doesn't stop us getting in an airplane. I mean, really, it's in civil society, we go on the balance of probabilities in the court of law. And in the court of law, a balance of probabilities, it's not even close. So I mean, there's uncertainty in everything we do. But scientific uncertainty is people, as Valerie said, have to recognize that you cannot prove anything in science. It's all about explaining all known observations of a phenomena with some theory, and then testing it and having it challenged. And there is no other explanation that people can come up with. And we've had a lot of people challenge it.
That's been the sad part. That's been the fuel for the denialists, is to say, well, if the scientists are uncertain, then believe me, I'm more certain.
I'm certain you're not certain.
What I have learned as a hydrologist is that when you deal with risk, you have indeed two components, the hazard and the vulnerability, at least. And the uncertainty that we are talking about is about the hazard and the probability that a certain event is likely or not to occur. But in fact, if you want to really look at the risk, you need also to look at the vulnerability. And so when you look at the consequences of climate change on our economies and societies, that I think they are so big that the risk, even if you have a certain uncertainty on the hazard, the total risk for our societies is so important that obviously we need to do something.
I'm reminded of the mathematician who was buying a plane ticket and was afraid of terrorism and asked the agent when he was buying the ticket, said, what are the odds of there being a bomb on the airplane? And the agent said, 1,000,000 to 1 against. I said, well, what are the odds of there being 2 bombs on the airplane? He said, astronomical, would never happen. So now he always travels with a bomb in his briefcase. Just to make sure. Yes, up here.
Hi. I'm a student at Quest University, Canada, studying climate change and communication. And I'm wondering what you think about the characterization of natural gas as a bridge fuel for developing nations.
So I alluded earlier to the work of colleagues that I have. There's about 8 major institutions around the world who they do modeling that. So we're not the climate modelers. These are energy economy emission systems. So think of Canada. What energy do we use? And what are the sources of the emissions? And they're not just from energy use. So they have other factors in there as well. Then they've been asked over and over again in the last decade, how do we stay within the 2 degrees Celsius that we've just been talking about? And so what they've done is they run their models and they have a breakout. They look at electricity sector in certain regions and groups of countries. They look at transportation. They look at the different industries and so on. And then we try to see when they're all running under different assumptions, what can we tease out from that? So there's some things I can tease out for you. One, coal consumption has to plateau now and start falling fairly quickly, or carbon capture and storage with the coal. Number 2, oil. Well, oil production of the very cheapest kind, because of that price fall that I was talking about that would happen. So the cheapest kind of oil might still produce, but oil that was unconventional, like oil sands, in no models does it expand in a world in which we get those emissions down to stay within 2C. So you wouldn't be building new pipelines. They don't go together in anybody's work with a whole bunch of different assumptions. With natural gas, you can have different assumptions that can lead you to agree to some increase in natural gas consumption in some parts of the world over a decade or 2. But that's just a decade or 2. Mostly that natural gas as well has to be combined with carbon capture and storage, or it has to be replaced by renewables and nuclear and more energy efficiency. So if a government here right now in British Columbia is telling us that they're saving the world by expanding natural gas production, that just doesn't map out with any of the modeling that's going on. Because remember, the Chinese are going to be increasing natural gas production themselves and getting it from nearby neighbors. So the chance that you would dramatically increase natural gas production in British Columbia, if that's where your question was headed, doesn't map out with any of those kinds of models. And then there are other assumptions that maybe others would want to talk about, which are even how much emissions happen in the fracking process, in leakage from pipes, and so on. That can lead to slightly different outcomes depending on the research assumptions that you pack into that. So if someone is telling you that natural gas is our savior here, I would be very suspicious.
Valerie? Valerie?
Yes, I can comment also on that. The comparison is, for instance, between gas and coal. In principle, gas is better for CO2 emissions if you have minimum leakage of methane in the atmosphere. And the ratio is between 2% leakage to 7% leakage. At 7%, it's like coal, or it can be worse on the short term. What happens is, if you compare coal to gas, if you produce both, you increase the total emissions of CO2. And that's what's happening with shale gas in the US. the US are shifting their electricity production to the use of gas, so their own emissions are decreasing. But they put on the market coal, and cheaper coal. And this coal is being shipped to Europe. And in Europe, sometimes the electricity company, they shut down the modern gas-producing factories, and they use the old coal ones. So it always has cascading side effects when you put on the market more supply of fossil fuels.
Tom?
I'll just put in a quick plug here. We actually addressed this issue at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions a week ago Monday, and if you look on our website, you'll see a white paper there called LNG in the Global Context, written by Matt Horn and Joshua McNabb of the Pembina Institute. We commissioned the study, and it addresses exactly that issue. So go to our website, and you can download that paper.
Madame?
Yes. For the developing country, we have 4 billion peoples, which can have access to solar energy. And it's the same, perhaps it's the same for the energy than for the phone. 2 billion peoples or 3 billion peoples are cellular phones, but less 1 billion have a fixed phone. I think that for the energy, it's the same process. And we have to support the development of solar energy because it's the less expensive and the more usual and for these people.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the end of our evening, so we only have time for 2 more questions. So who has the mic? There you are, sir. Yeah.
Hi, Dennis from UBC Clean Energy Engineering. The question is, part 1 for panel from France is, when we look at EU's low emissions, a large portion of it comes from nuclear power supplied by France. Where do you guys see the future for nuclear as EU continues to reduce their emissions? Part 2 for the British Columbia representation is that clean energy development, as you mentioned, one of the examples, Pulse Energy, hinges on the reputation of BC as a clean sort of emission province. Another entity located in Vancouver, Westport Industries, develops products that are primarily utilizing the LNG to displace diesel in engines. So could you comment on the other side of the industry that's touted as clean as well? Thank you.
Okay. 2 questions. First for France, the role of nuclear power.
My opinion is not the opinion of my government, and it's not the opinion of the majority of the political makers in France. But personally, I think that the nuclear system is the most expensive today, is dangerous, and for the future is not a solution. Today is very few yes. Today, a few countries use nuclear energy, and nuclear energy is a very, very little part of the mix energetic in the world. And we have the waste problem, we have the insurance problem, and today renewable energy are less expensive. For this reason, I think that is not for the future. But it's my opinion, and it's not the opinion of the majority of French people and political people in France.
Thank you. Okay, the issue of the alternatives, yeah.
You asked about Westport Innovations, and Westport is, I guess, the world's leading manufacturer now and developed, in fact, injection technology for using natural gas in internal combustion engines, primarily diesel. And that was a UBC spin-off, in fact, as you probably know. That's a very good technology because there is an emissions reduction if you switch from diesel to natural gas. There's also a significant reduction in particulate emissions, which has a health implication that can be negative in the sense of diesel. So there is a net gain to be made if you switch. The city of Surrey is now in the process of entirely switching over its heavy vehicle fleet. All of its garbage trucks and so on are switching to natural gas using Westport technology. And if you want to get the details on the actual savings energy-wise there, go to the PICS website and download the briefing note that was co-authored by Eric Kajang.
Thank you very much. Okay, our final question over here. Yes.
Under international treaties, each country is only responsible for its own emissions, but the situation is complicated by global trade, and I think it's well illustrated by France and Canada. So on one hand, Western European countries since 1990 have reduced their emissions, but increased their carbon footprint by increasingly relying on import of goods that are carbon intensive in manufacturing. At the other end of the carbon supply chain, we've got a country like Canada that is exporting fossil fuels, and we're exporting essentially another Canada's worth of carbon, getting rich doing it. So in a sense, global trade is allowing us to evade our responsibility by shifting the emissions onto some other country. And I'm curious what you see as ways to think about our responsibility in that global context, and what sort of policy solutions will hold countries to that responsibility.
Oh, I can start. So that is a discourse that I've certainly heard, which is, if China decides to make products by burning coal and I buy that product in Canada, that I'm responsible for the emissions that China decided to emit. They could have made that product without emitting. So, right, we're just talking about all the alternatives to that, including even using coal with carbon capture and storage. So for me, the interesting question isn't an accounting question, it's a policy question. And I have already talked about the answer that I think is inevitable is one of emissions-based tariffs. I don't see any other way around that particular problem. I've heard the anti-growth discourse, which I support in many ways, will say, haha, so there's the problem, we can't consume. The Chinese will say, we really want you to consume. That's how money got transferred, and we had some economic development. So there are some very fundamental questions there. But if we're just trying to say that anytime anyone in another country produces a product that we buy, but we weren't able to control how much emissions they caused in producing it, then we have this dilemma of what do? We either don't buy it, or we put a tariff on it. If we put a tariff on it, we might not buy it anyway, or that might motivate them to produce it without so much coal. So, I don't see the other solution.
Okay. Danielle?
Of course, this is a very important issue. I've been working on water, and we have almost the same type of issue with water. You buy food produced in other countries, and you contribute also to water scarcity or misuse of water in other parts of the world. And so it's clearly shows that there is a need for a global vision of what is happening, and also that the rhythm, the pace under which we progress needs to be coordinated between countries. That's always my also comment that I make when I think of the French or European policy. If you go too fast, you run the risk that indeed you delocalize your carbon footprint. It's a matter of rhythm, and you need to ensure that the rhythm under which you progress between the different countries is not too different, in order to avoid these delocalization of carbon footprint. So again, having a carbon price agreed also in Paris would be one of the elements that would avoid moving toward this type of not solutions, but problems that could result from just bilateral or local agreements that would then have these side effects that are not really expected and not good for globally.
Thank you very much. Valerie?
Can I make a joke?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's a good argument to buy things made in France.
Okay. There was a question earlier about a plan B. What do we have as a backup if all the discussions and the climate talks fail and the politicians can't come to agreement? Well, I've seen it. It's going around another star. It's a planet that is most like the Earth. I think it's called Pegasus 51b. I'm not sure. And it is just a little bit bigger than the Earth, but it has our type of climate. It has water. It has weather. It may have life on it. We're trying to find out. Maybe we could just go there if we trash the Earth. There's only one tiny little problem we have to overcome before we move there. It's 500 light years from here. So even if we could travel at the speed of light, which we can't, it would take 5 times a human lifetime just to get to it. So yeah, there are lots of other places we could go, but we don't have the ability to do that. So this is it. We live in the Garden of Eden. And nature always wins. This is it. Thank you to our panelists tonight. I would like to thank everyone for being with us. Thank you for your comments. Thank you to our panelists tonight. I would like to thank everyone for being with us.